So let's start by saying what a timely time this is to talk about grief. I saw a quote in the Washington Post that said, "What a year these pandemic months have been." Isn't that the truth? Holy moly. It seems like we've been trying to adjust to this pandemic lifestyle forever, and it's only been 100+ days since most of us had the old normal. So right now, in addition to any personal losses that you and I might be experiencing, there's so much loss in society as a whole, because almost everybody we know has lost a job, or their business is struggling, or they've had a death. Or I just talked to somebody yesterday who has 10 siblings and their parent died and people couldn't come to the funeral. So that's a loss on top of a loss. It's a lot. On the other hand, I like to remind myself that we've survived 100% of our worst days. I think you might want to make a sign and hang that up for yourself. So far, you've survived 100% of your worst days. And I feel confident that with the help of God, we'll survive this too. But this whole experience, both of personal loss and societal loss, is a very powerful lesson in impermanence. And I think it's one that's particularly challenging for Americans because we don't really like to be reminded of impermanence. Our cultural ethos is very built around, be strong, figure out the problem, solve it, control the outcomes, prepare for what could go wrong. And those are great things about our national character. And at the same time, we don't have a real strong part in our national character that says, appreciate it while you have it. Things can change in a moment. Not everything is under our control. Sometimes control is really an illusion. And some other cultures are more steeped in that mentality than we are. So we're getting a chance to learn that. I'm mindful of the Japanese culture, which of course has its own issues. Everyone does. But in my book, I wrote about the beautiful tradition of stopping everything for a day and going out to see the cherry blossoms when they first open. I mean, companies will rent a bus and take all their employees to a cherry grove, and people hang lanterns in the trees and have picnics. And it's a really powerful cultural moment of, this won't last long. It's ephemeral. We have to enjoy it and take it in while we have it. Soon these beautiful blossoms will be on the ground. So Robert Frost captured that, an American poet, for us in his poem, Nothing Gold Can Stay. It ends with, dawn goes down today, nothing gold can stay. So just like the cycle of sunrise and sunset happens every day, there are always going to be losses, large and small, in life. And I had two significant losses of my own, actually almost exactly 2 years ago. My dad went in for a routine hip surgery and had a massive stroke, and we had to put him right into hospice. There wasn't a thing they could do for him. And then about a month later, my mother had a massive stroke. I mean, what are the chances of that? So like everybody has, their own grief story. I think, it's significant that just a little bit about my story so that you know where I'm coming from. All right. So this was me on unboxing day when the books finally came. I was supposed to write it in a year. It took me 4 years. So that gives you a sense of, I hope, blessing your own grief struggle and how long it might take you to learn how to carry grief. Personally, I avoid terms like even healing grief sets some people off, but I definitely avoid terms like resolving grief or closure. I think closure, while very widely embraced when people first started to talk about it has done us a great disservice, because more recent research, and I'll bet your experience as well as mine, makes closure not really the right fit for what happens with grief. I believe we navigate grief. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the tasks of mourning. And I believe we learn to carry grief. Anne Lamott has she's a spiritual writer. She's a clever saying that I can't quite come up with, but she says, learning to carry these difficulties is like learning to walk with a limp. You walk again, but it's never exactly the same gait as it was before. So that you know where I'm coming from in the rest of my presentations, I want to start with this. Your loss is not a test. Your loss is not a lesson. Your loss is not a gift. Your loss is a loss. Now, here's what I mean by that. First and foremost, I believe we are called to do the work of grieving, to enter into the grief and just be with it. I hope for you and for me that I will learn lessons from my grief. I hope that my loss eventually could become a gift to others in the way, I get to do workshops on this now, or the way I was able to finally release the book. I don't believe with any part of myself, and you may disagree, that loss is not a test. I think I mentioned to you that I started out as a theology teacher 1,000 years ago. And I saw early on that saying the wrong thing to someone who has just had a death in the family can turn them off to religion and God for the rest of their lives. So I had a student, her name was Amy, and she had a beloved grandmother who she was actually closer to than her parents. And her grandmother died when she was a junior in high school, and I was teaching her in class at that time. I'd have her several times. We were a small school. And she came in to me after school one day just sobbing because someone at the funeral home said to her something like, God needed another angel and only the good die young, and so on. And she was just sobbingly furious to think that, God gets up one morning and makes a decision. Okay, you, and you. She said, doesn't God know that I needed my grandmother, more than God did? And that's an example of somebody who's devastated by thoughtless comfort. And I don't mean ill-meant comfort. I've said thoughtless things myself. I'm ashamed to admit it, that as I know better, I do better. We probably all could admit to that. But I don't believe that God decides to test somebody by sending them an illness or taking away a loved one that their life will never be the same without. I think loss is loss, and then we make of it what we will. It can be an opportunity to hollow out, to become a deeper human being, to become a more empathetic human being. One of the books that I really gained a lot of joy from, quiet joy, when I was grieving was called Broken Open, and I recommend it. And one of the things that author said was, when you experience grief, you can either break apart, and some people do. It's not true that everybody is made stronger by these kinds of tests. That's not true. But it is true that you can keep being presented with a choice to be less broken apart, or not broken apart, but broken open. And that is a bittersweet but very growthful kind of being broken. And I'm going to read you a poem about that before we're finished. So I think it's okay to laugh also while you're grieving. I know I did a lot of laughing at myself when I was circling the drain. Grief brain. We've heard of, pregnancy brain and chemo brain. Well, grief brain is a very real thing. And I'm actually sending you out like missionaries after these 2 talks to teach other people about grief brain. And that even though most businesses allow, 3 days for a death in the family, there's hardly a person alive who's ready to get back up to speed or go back to work after only 3 days. I mean, they might be there, but the grief brain makes a big difference in how well we can function for a while till we learn how to carry this thing. So, we would like grief to work in a very linear way, a straight line from point A to point B. But the second drawing is actually a much better image for how grief works. And I want you to memorize this image so that you could sketch it for somebody else that you may share with about grief, because we have this notion in the United States that has in other countries too, that has not been helpful, that you move through grief in a linear stages kind of way. And all the recent research says that that is not the case. And the difficulty of this, of course, is that it makes us impatient with our own grief. So we add insult to injury. We not only are miserable or brokenhearted, but we're also beating ourselves up saying, how come I'm not getting over this sooner? Or yesterday I had a pretty good day and I was able to get things done and think more clearly. And now today, it's just the opposite. And that can make us impatient with ourselves at a time when we should really be learning how to practice better self-compassion. Now, one reason for this impatience, which I adore this little guy, I identify with him, is because we don't have many customs of mourning anymore. And not that long ago, even just 100 years ago, when someone had a death in the family, they would hang black crepe or a wreath on the door. They would wear a black armband. Women would often dress in black for at least 6 months to show they were in mourning. And then after 6 months, they would go to half mourning, which was gray or lilac. And so just by meeting someone new, they knew that you had had a loss. And part of the reason for all that was to cut the person some slack, to recognize that you may invite them for tea and they accept gratefully. And then on the day they're supposed to show up for tea, they just can't do it because they're too sad. We don't have any significations like that anymore. And so there's a lot of kind of faking it, people suffering very silently and privately because others are impatient with their grief and maybe they are impatient with their own grief. So part of my message today is that you can't do everything. When you're at your best, you can't do everything. And when you're grieving, a significant, slice of your energy pie is taken up doing the work of grief. Work of grief isn't even a phrase that most people that you might be in ministry with, if you are a Stevens minister, or if you do pastoral ministry, if you're in healthcare, if you're a chaplain, if you're clergy. I mean, everyone's welcome. You may not fall into any of those categories, but if you do, you know that when you talk to people about the work of grief, a lot of times they don't even know what you mean. So one of the first poems in the book, which I really love and which helped me a lot myself, is called Grief Comes with a Ladder. And the gist of that poem is captured in a couple lines. Grief comes with a ladder, though not for ascending. The point of the poet, who has suffered losses of his own, is that you have to go down before you're willing to go up. And this actually squares very well with the research of a very popular figure now who, if you don't know her work, I commend it to you. Brené Brown, B-R-E-N-E is her first name, Brown like the color. And Brené Brown is, she's written several marvelous books and she's all over YouTube. And her Facebook page is very worth following. And she is a researcher on vulnerability, first and foremost, and then eventually her research expanded to related topics related to vulnerability. But the gist of what she found was that people who cut themselves off from being vulnerable, so the more challenging, maybe we would think of as the lower feelings, because they're not exactly what you get up in the morning hoping for. I don't think anybody leaps out of bed saying, boy, I hope something really bad happens today so I have a chance to be vulnerable and learn all kinds of lessons and model spiritual maturity for others. I don't think any of you are saying that. And I don't think Brené Brown is saying that either. But if you live long enough, those opportunities are going to come. But if you cut yourself off from that, she says you also have a tendency to cut yourself off from the more joyful exuberant feelings that are on the other end of the range. So one of the poems in the book talks about how the speaker in the poem is saying, grief, I know you've been living under my porch and you want to come in and be my own dog, but I kept you outside, living under the porch because I didn't want to lay claim to you as my own dog. But by the end of the poem, the poet has realized that I need to name you as mine, or I won't ever come to grips with this thing that has happened to me. So this all sounds great. And if we were all possessed of a Buddha-like calm, we would be getting A+ for doing our grief work. But as much as I love this statue who remains extremely calm despite a missing nose and cracks, I'm really more like the monkey who's sitting on his shoulder, telling myself I have a Buddha-like calm and occasionally having it. I'm a Christian, I'm not a Buddhist, but I admire some of the teachings of on calm and acceptance that our Buddhist brothers and sisters have shared with us. And so here's another opportunity to laugh at ourselves. One day you're maybe writing in your journal, you're bringing your grief to prayer, you're doing small things that honor the person you've lost. And then the next day you're just mad, you're just in a bad mood, or you're just, you don't want to do any grief work. You just want to get on a boat to the islands, and that's normal.